Hello, and welcome to my podcast, Good Grief. My name is Dr. Christine Malone, and in this podcast, we talk about trauma, tragedy, and survival. In each episode, I will interview someone that has gone through grief in some way, and we will discuss the impact it has had on their life. By sharing these stories, we hope that others won't feel alone should they be going through similar situations. Enjoy. Okay, listeners, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. My guest today is going to tell us a bit about his loss of his wife and the book he wrote after that, and some of the lessons he's learned and what he's imparted in his book. So, guest, if you would please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Christine, my name is Warren Kozak. I live in New York City, but I grew up in the Midwest in Wisconsin. And I still have a home in Wisconsin where I try and spend as much time in the summer as I can. And I have, career-wise, I have spent most of my life as a journalist, most of the time at ABC, where I was a writer for different anchors. And then for the last 25 years, I've worked for a philanthropist here in New York, writing speeches, traveling. He is involved with all sorts of different things, and I feel very fortunate to have that job. The book is about losing my wife, and that's what you and I are going to talk about. I think we could just dive right into that.
Sure.
As you can see, I'd rather not even talk about myself. It's like
That's quite all right. Well, tell me a bit about your wife. So you were married for how long?
20 years.
20 years.
We were together, married for 20 years. The way I describe it in the book is that I had the tremendous capacity for making completely awful, really terrible choices. And I was always optimistic that I would meet someone that worked for me, but I couldn't quite figure out the equation that all the people around me seemed to figure out. And my two closest friends and college roommates got married right after college to their college girlfriends. And I couldn't seem to do that. And then one day, and I write about this, the most random of days, I'm standing with a friend and he asked me the world's most mundane question. Do you want to meet someone? And I just rolled my eyes and I thought, oh God, yeah, right. Another wasted evening. And I was even thinking on that night of canceling because the weather was awful and I was just in a lousy mood. And it's a lesson to everyone out there. Don't give up and don't say no to anything. And I thought, well, they went to a lot of bother to make dinner. And I went over to their house and I got there first. And in walks this amazing woman with the deepest blue eyes I have ever seen. And I tried not to stare at her during dinner. I didn't want her to think I was just staring at her. And so here is the weird part of the story. And I've thought about this. It was a wonderful evening, really interesting conversation. And then we realized it was very late. It was a school night. We had to get up and go to work the next morning. So we thanked our hosts and we left, and we're standing it's a New York apartment building. So we're waiting for the elevator in the lobby, or not in the lobby, and on their floor. And all of a sudden we didn't have the other couple to back us up anymore. And there's that awkward moment where we're just kind of staring at each other. And I said, well, that went rather well. Do you want to get married? And she just stared at me. When we got down, she got into the cab. She said, good night. And she said later, what she really meant was goodbye, because she thought I seemed okay, but that was kind of a nutty thing to say.
Which question? Yeah.
I said later, I was just trying to break that awkward silence with some humor. But the fact is, I never said that to anyone 4 hours after meeting them. So there was something else going on. She then told her friends the story, and they said, well, sounds like this guy might be interesting. Why didn't you give him another chance? And luckily she did. We got together very quickly, and within a year of that meeting, we were married, and our daughter was on the way. So it was a very good start, and
Yeah.
I feel very grateful for that. She was an internist, a doctor, general medicine, and and a really smart clinician that came up. So
Yeah. Oh, that's a great story. I always hear those. It's always meant to be stories. It's like, I think that was something was in the stars for you there for sure. So,
yeah,
so
but
just the one.
let's point out I knew it first. Okay.
She was the smart cookie. You just said that. So you had just the one daughter together, or do you have more than one?
We had we have our, I shouldn't say just, joy of our lives,
Yeah,
and it was wonderful raising her here in New
yeah.
York. She's our New Yorker. We born and raised here. My wife was from Philadelphia and very much a Philadelphia girl. As I said, I'm from Wisconsin, so but we
Yeah.
do have a New Yorker in the family.
There you go. There you go. Yeah, a little bit for everybody for sure.
Yep.
So she ended up becoming ill. So I know you said she was a rare cancer that she had.
Yes. January of 2014, she was diagnosed with a rare blood cancer with a ridiculously long name, Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia.
Good heavens. Okay.
Yeah, and it's not a killer cancer. And there were people in the support group that were in their 80s who had been diagnosed for over 20 years, and they seemed to be doing fine. And Lisa said, well, I think we're going to treat this as a chronic illness. However, there was something else going on, and she knew there was something wrong. And she actually also taught at NYU Medical School, and one of the things she would always try and convey to her students was listen to the patient, listen to what they're saying.
Oh,
And of this group, a very small number of people get Waldenstrom's. An even smaller, teeny tiny fraction of that group gets amyloidosis, which is the way it was described by one of the doctors is imagine sand coursing through your bloodstream, and it just wreaks havoc on your heart and all of your organs. She thought, and she was unfortunately correct, that she had amyloidosis. And when she told this to her, the main doctor at the time, that doctor said, there's no way you have amyloid. I already had my one amyloid this year. There's no way I could have two. Well, she was right, unfortunately. And what I didn't get was that when that was confirmed, she knew it was a death sentence. I didn't. I didn't understand that. So she was diagnosed in 2014. The last 2 years were horrific. They were pretty awful. Most of it was spent in the hospital. And then I want to go back to my boss for a second. He travels a lot, and I traveled with him. And when Lisa got sick, he said, I don't want you traveling with me. I want you to work remotely. Because if something happens to her while you're with me, I'm gonna be too upset about that. Because of him, I was able to be with her for the last 4 years of her life, but mostly those last 2 years. And you don't find bosses like that. I know how unbelievably lucky I am to have this man, as my boss. I know if I had been at ABC still, I would have had a choice, either leave my job, which also meant losing my health coverage,
right.
or not be with her. She was mostly in the hospital. I was trying to also take care of our daughter, who was a senior in high school and then went to college for her freshman year. And I was also trying to do my job from, I'd be typing, on my computer next to her in the hospital room. And one of the things that fascinated me, and I'm wondering if you have come across this, I'm sure you have, I could do all of those things and I could do them really well, I thought. I was taking care of everything. When she died, my brain just went out to lunch, and that shocked me. That just shocked me. I had no concentration. I wasn't able to read anything. The work I did wasn't that good, I think. And I had all these ideas of, when she was in the hospital, I would think, okay, what happens to my life after she's gone? What will I do? And I thought, all those books that I haven't been able to read. I even saved my daughter's high school algebra book, her earth science book, and the other one, because I thought I'll reread these. I'll reacquaint myself with these. they're sitting unopened on the bookshelf behind me. And I just could not.
Yeah,
I
your brain
lost.
doesn't work. Your brain doesn't work. I'll tell you a quick little story about myself after when I was living in New York and my fiance was killed in a car accident, and it was my first real experience with extreme grief of loss like that. And I moved back out here to Seattle, and I stayed with my mother, and she let me use her car because of course I had moved back here, didn't have a car anymore, I lived in New York. And I drove her car to the shopping mall, and I'm in the shopping mall, and I came out and I'd forgotten where I parked, and I was having a bit of a panic attack over it. So I sat on the steps of the shopping mall and I'm crying. And the security person comes out and he says to me, "What's happened?" And I said, "I can't find my car." And he said, "What kind of car do you drive?" And I said, "I don't remember." I did not remember what the car was. And so here, I think he's going to end up calling me a loony bin for me, but I'm thinking my brain just did not work. So I completely understand your brain stops. And I remember, thankfully, a good therapist said to me, "It will come back one day." And it did. And I'm very thankful it did. But when I hear people tell me that, it's like, oh, you'll get through that. That's tough when when your mind just doesn't focus on anything anymore. So I completely hear what you're saying there.
And it does come back. It comes back incrementally. Well, that's the way it came back for me. For some people, it comes back faster. For some people, less so. Everyone is different. One of my friends who is in the book and was actually the spark for the entire idea of writing this book. Compared it to fingerprints, he said everyone's fingerprints are different, and everyone will handle this differently. And I think that there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
But the good news is it does come back, but in my case, it took a while.
Yeah. Yeah. That was my experience as well. Not all
Yeah.
at once. And it was hard because I know, and you sound a bit like me in that I like to be very busy. I like to be very engaged and involved in a million different things at once. Um, yeah. And so when your mind doesn't keep up with you, it's very frustrating. So I used to think to myself, it must be like when you get diagnosed with dementia, is what I used to think about that, because it's kind of like I
Sure.
can't do what I used to be able to do. And it was frustrating to remember that. So
There was
yeah.
a line in the Joan Didion book that really resonated with me. And a friend of hers said, after a year, I could read headlines.
Yeah.
And really, really hit home for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because part of my job is to keep up with the news. I have to read everything that's coming in. And I just couldn't for that first year.
Yep. Yep. No, and then you have to be patient with yourself. And I always tell people, give yourself grace, which not a lot of people know how to do that. So they don't, they just get frustrated. And then the world, of course, doesn't really deal well with grieving people. We get what most jobs, you get the 3 days bereavement leave after someone passes, and they expect you to just jump right back in and get right back on it. And it's like some grief, you just don't get right back on it afterwards. And your life will change. I know in my case, my life changed after each of the experiences I went through, and some for the bad, but then some for the good. And it's kind of like when people say to me now, "Oh, I've lost this thing that happened. When am I going to feel like I used to?" My answer is always, never. You're never going to feel like you used to, because you're a different person now. And that's not bad. It's just you have to embrace that and know that, because if you're going to try to get back to where you were then, you aren't, because this person's not here, and whatever. So those are kind of hard conversations to have with the newly grieving, I should say. So
I
so
got
what?
an email. Hold your question because I want to, but I got an email from a very dear friend of mine who is one of the leading experts in the country on Alzheimer's.
Mm,
More important to this story is that he lost his wife 6 years before my wife passed away. And I wrote him a medical question and I said, "How long does it physically hurt?" And what he wrote back was such a short but stunning email. And he said something like, "It becomes an emotional and psychological scar. Mostly it's the realization of how your life has changed so dramatically,
mhm.
um, and how you have to reinvent yourself." And I read this was just weeks after Lisa died. I didn't quite understand it. I have only come to understand it, over the years, over the 5 years when I then wrote the book. And there's a great deal of truth to it. You are a different person and you have to reinvent yourself.
Yeah,
And who would have ever thought that you would have to do something like that?
I know. I know. It's and I've also had people say, "Well, gosh, do you regret, whatever, like my son that passed away, do you regret that, he ever came to be?" And I'm like, "No, I don't regret a darn thing about what he brought to my life, because he changed me in a very good way." Yes, painful, but very, very still, I wouldn't change the memories for anything. So
Exactly.
I'm
Yeah.
hearing that in your story as well. So
Yep.
what was it, I'm going to guess, but what was it that inspired you to write the book? Were you wanting to kind of just get your thoughts out, or were you thinking it would just be helpful to other people, a little bit of both?
Right after Lisa died, I was in such bad shape. I looked for any kind of help I could find, and people brought books. I looked for books, and many of the books were written in a very academic style, like, by psychologists, psychiatrists,
Yeah.
grief people, and they were impenetrable for me. I could not read them. I had trouble with that kind of language, frankly, when I was in college, and my brain was, somewhat. I don't know if it was or not when you're 18 or 19, but um, I could not read them, and I decided to write this in the plainest possible language for people in that first year. Short chapters, very clear and pretty basic. This is what happened. This is what worked. This is what didn't work. Some of the stories along the way. Some of the stories were even funny. I mean, it's life. So, there's irony and there was humor during this period. And I threw that in too. I also have to tell you another quick story. I had a friend, Elizabeth McCormick, who we shared the same birthday, and she was exactly 30 years older than me. And she was a former nun. She was a major educator. She ran a Catholic girls' school here in New York, and then she left her order and had a very different job after that. Right after Lisa died, our mutual friend had a small birthday party for us. So I was turning about 66, and she was turning 96. And someone said, "So, Elizabeth, what have you learned in your 96 years?" And without missing a beat, she said, "When you help others, you feel better about yourself." And that has always stayed with me.
Yeah.
So I write this book. I'm thinking maybe it'll help someone. And since it came out last month, I have been getting email after email from people I don't know who have said, "This is the first book that actually resonated with me." And I thought, wow, this is exactly why I wanted to write the book, what I was hoping, some people might get out of it. And guess what? It made me feel better.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like something good can come out of something awful.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And you made a really good point about some of the books that are out there are written by, the experts who maybe studied the topics and not just grief, but any topic. But unless you've been there, I mean, I will say, it's like trying to describe to somebody what it's like to have a panic attack. If you've never had one, it is impossible to describe. I
Sure.
can't, I can't describe to you what it's like to be lost in enormous grief unless you have to, and unfortunately, you have to be there to really get it, right? So have something written by someone who's been in those shoes, clearly I can see where that would be a whole lot more useful to someone than a book that's just about the science of it or the, what resources are out there, which, helpful, but what's it like to really be in those shoes and to feel that way?
Yeah, and one can give a very clinical description of a panic attack, and you can look at it and try and understand it, but it doesn't describe, I'm sorry, it just won't describe what it was like for you sitting in that parking lot.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. It's like pain, right? Describe pain. I mean, things are
Yeah.
subjective for one thing. It's kind of like we don't all feel things the same way. So really to be able to, to listen to someone's story and go, oh my gosh, that person knows what I feel like is, I think the power of support groups, which I'm a big fan of, and so on for the same reason. It's just, you're not alone. You're not the only one out there who's experienced this, and you're not some kind of freak because you don't know what your car is today. So, those types of things are really, I think, are helpful. So it's only been out for a month. That I said month, that month. That's not very long out there.
Just about a month. Yeah. Came out, in fact, almost a month to the day. And yeah.
That's great. What now? If you do you now that you think about it, having it's only been out for a month, is there anything that you think you could have or would have put into it if you thought about it at the time of your writing?
I was telling somebody recently, in the old days when people wrote books, they would type out manuscripts and they would bring these big manuscripts to the publisher. Nowadays, you hit a button and it goes off. And before I sent this, I really hesitated. Because the other books that I've written were very different and they were not about me. And this is a very personal book.
Yes.
And I was about to hit send, and I'm thinking, oh, great, I'm going to open up my entire life to the world.
Yeah.
And I really hesitated there. And as I said at the very beginning, when you asked me to describe myself, that's about as far as I wanted to go. I didn't want to, and you and I have been with people who can't stop talking about themselves. And,
Indeed. Indeed.
yeah. And, it makes you want to vomit, or it makes me want to. And I try and get away from those people as fast as I can. If there were a couple of other elements in the book, some people have said, you didn't write anything about moving on, about dating. And I thought that was too personal for other people. And I didn't want to raise that. I didn't, I thought that would be wrong to do that, to talk about dating. And let's be honest, it's a big part of moving on, and
It can be. And it can be that whole guilt situation where, I've been with this person forever. How can I think about being with someone else? Kind of
don't think I haven't suffered from that too. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I know. And I'll also speak to the fact I've written other books too. My books are all textbooks, so they're completely fact-based, rather boring. When I wrote my memoir, it was surprising how raw that made me feel. Very, very vulnerable, and yet very healing to put it out there. It was like, oh my gosh, this is stuff that's just it's who I am, and it's okay that that's who I am. And those were and again, sharing stories with people in this podcast, it's like, oh my goodness, we're human, right? We're all human, and we've all had to learn things, and sometimes things and we're really hard. But
so here's something I just on that score, something I didn't expect, and I probably should have. I had really, it's now been 6 years, I thought I had made tremendous progress. But over the last month, I've been doing podcasts like this. I was on a local TV station on Friday, and talking about Lisa and talking about this has brought it all back. So I'm thinking, this morning, yesterday morning, I was feeling kind of low for a variety of reasons. And I thought, oh man, if I had realized I was going to bring it all back, would I have still done it? I don't know. Well, it's done. So, it's out there, and here we are talking about it.
Yeah. And well, then you also brought up there was some humor in there. So you want to have any of the humorous stories you'd like to share with our listeners?
I'll give you a couple. Near the end of her stay, I put Lisa into a private room at Columbia Presbyterian here in New York. And I had to, they had a really weird billing system where I had to pay every day. So I would be with her until late at night. The business office at the hospital is open 24 hours. And then on my way out, I would give them a credit card. I don't know why they did it this way, for whatever reason. One day, my boss called and he said, is it possible for you to come in for a meeting? I'd really like you here. And I said, sure. Yeah, I can do that. So I left early, and I went down to the business office on my way out, and there was a different guy there. And I give him my credit card, and he hands me these 3 forms. He said, you sign all 3. And I said, I never had to sign a form before. Is this new? And he said, we always do it this way. We will not release the body unless you sign all 3 forms. And I said, my wife has cancer. She's not doing that great, but I just left her about 2 minutes ago. I'm pretty sure she was still breathing. And the guy just turned ashen. He said, I am so sorry. It's just that the only people that ever walk in here with suits and ties on are undertakers.
Oh my goodness.
So I said, thank you for that. It's the first good laugh I have had in weeks. The other story was about a year after Lisa died. Claire and I were at the wedding of one of her favorite cousins in San Francisco, and I had to be in Europe for work, so I was going to fly directly there. She had to be at a school program in England. So I said, why don't you come with me? When I'm done, we'll go on a little vacation, and then you can go off to London, and I'll go back home. And so a friend asked if I would like to meet someone. And I said, look, a friend of his was there. And I said, I'm not ready for this. Plus I'm going to be there with Claire, with my daughter. And he said, so bring her along. Just, meet her. You never know. So the last night we were there, we met this woman for dinner, and it was very nice, and we had a pleasant time. And then Claire and I decided to walk back to our hotel. And as we're walking back, she said, may I make some observations? And I said, okay, go ahead. And she said, well, first of all, you weren't interested in her at all, which was true. But I said, okay. And she said, but someday you will meet someone you're going to be interested in. And when that happens, you shouldn't mention mommy 10 times in the conversation. It makes them feel insecure. And I thought, I am now getting dating advice from someone I diapered, which gave me an indication of how my life had just turned upside down, inside out. But it was very sweet of her too. It was a very sweet. I love that story.
That's actually a really interesting story. So I did online dating for a couple of years before I met my husband that I'm married to now.
Oh God, we could do a podcast on that alone.
I'm going to write a book about it someday because I have some incredibly funny stories. But I had one gentleman I met whose wife had passed, and we met at a Starbucks, and he brought a photo album, and I wasn't sure what the photo album was going to be about, but it was his wife and their family, and he's showing me this photo album, and he burst into tears. And I said, oh my gosh, how long has it been since your wife passed? It had been 3 months. I'm going, 3 months. I'm in this Starbucks with this man who I'm now doing grief counseling with because I'm
it was supposed to be a get together.
Well, right. And then at the end of the coffee, I said, well, I'm going to go now. And he said, well, can we see each other again? I said, I don't think so. I think you need to see a therapist and help yourself out.
Not me.
But I'm not that person. Oh God, that made me think of that when you said about talking about mommy. It's like, oh yeah, I remember that. The guy thinking, hey, you really need to, if you're really going to get back into the dating, you might want to be a little bit less, or a little bit more available to yourself, I guess. I don't know, but that was a funny but not funny story that my morbid sense of humor enjoyed. But yes, there's that. So it's been so 6 years since Lisa passed. Is that right?
6 years and 4 months. Yeah.
4 months. So how are you doing today? How are things going for you today?
Someone said that's the way you ask that question today. How are you today?
Exactly why I said that. How are you doing today?
I'm doing so much better. And in that first year, I never thought I would be saying that. And the reason, Christine, is that in that first year, the person that caused the grief, you realize is not going to walk back through the front door the way she did thousands of times before and alleviate it. So you just think this is going to be the way you are for the rest of your life. This is the way I am. I'm stuck with this. This is my life. And that doesn't happen. I wouldn't have believed that in that first year. And it was better after the first year, better still after the second year. I had fabulous friends that supported me. I have, this wonderful daughter. I have so many pluses that I'm grateful for. And I had a great marriage. And I have a lot of friends that don't have great marriages. So how lucky was I to get that? When it hit me it was about 5 years out. And I was walking down Madison Avenue on a gorgeous October day, just one of those perfect days. And I had my AirPods in my ear and I was listening to a great piece of music. I remember people were smiling on the street. You don't see that in New York too often anymore. They looked happy. And all of a sudden I realized, oh my God, I'm happy. I'm happy to be alive. I'm happy to be walking down the street. I didn't win the lottery. I didn't do anything. It was nothing. It was the most random of days, but I was just filled with joy. And I didn't think that would ever happen again.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there are days like that. And it's sometimes still, it'll come back and bite you too. And I think I have come to and understand all these little phrases that I heard in that first year that I thought were silly, have actually come true. And I have learned how to live with it. I've learned how to live with the loss. I've put it in its own compartment. And there is something else that I talk about in the book. And when you don't, Lisa and I would talk all day long. we would be texting each other. If something came up, we would call each other. And then we would sit at night after Claire was old enough and she would go to her room to do her homework. We would sit at the table and talk for another hour, 2 hours sometimes. And there was an old phrase, and I don't remember it exactly, about the real intercourse between two people who's talking. And boy, we were able to talk right from the start, really. When you haven't talked to someone or seen them for weeks and then months and then years, it's got to take its toll. And she has become more distant. I mean, she's still ever present in some ways, but she is also distant. And I think that's also had an impact on me. And it's probably made my life a little bit easier. In that first year, she was all over this apartment. She was everywhere. That's not the case anymore. Yeah. It just reminds me of another story. Right after she died, I started traveling again with my boss, and we were in Israel, and there was a guy that we were talking with who had lost his wife just recently, also 4 young kids. And he gave me his advice. He said, sell your apartment, sell everything in it, buy a new place, get new furniture. Otherwise you will have a museum to your dead wife. And I thought, whoa, I love this place. I'm not going to do that. And even though it was hard to come back in that first year, I love coming back to it. And I have such fabulous memories of this is where we were a couple. This is where we were a family. This is where we had, the happiest memories. And I'm very happy here. So I'm very glad I didn't take that guy's advice. It might work for some people. That's fine, but it wouldn't have worked for me.
Might be someone's answer, but not always. I know in my case, when my son passed away, he was disabled during his life. And when he passed away, my husband and I gave up a lot of his medical supplies, but I kept his wheelchair for years. I kept his wheelchair. And I remember people thinking, why would you? Well, because it's to me, it has a memory of how we could move him around, how we could get him from place to place. It had happy memories, which I can't really explain to someone who hasn't been in those shoes. But I did eventually donate it to a woman who had adopted two children, two siblings that were disabled. So my son's chair went to 2 boys eventually, which made me feel really good about that. But I get it. Sometimes coming back to I stayed in the same house for years after my son passed away. I did finally move because it was just a huge house and it was just me then. And I thought, I can't, but it did. To me, it was like, this is where my memories are. And it was wonderful. And I didn't think poorly about it. I also get why someone would want to move away. Maybe the pain is just too, I don't know. But again,
to each his own. And as we said earlier, everyone is different. Everyone has a different fingerprint on this one.
Yep, exactly. So to tell someone, I know, like, so when people will ask me, well, what should I do about this? I'm like, well, what do you feel like you should do? And I also will caution you not to make any decisions right away, because you may regret them if you do them in haste, if you get rid of all that stuff. And then all of a sudden it's like, why did I get rid of that? But whatever. But we're all on our own personal journey, and that's no judgment from me. Whenever someone tells me their story about that, it's like, well, what works for you? What works for you? Because I'll tell you what worked for me, but it may not work for you. So there's all that. Well, is there anything else you'd like to share before we end our episode today?
I'd like to keep talking. Really fun. It's so pleasant. I'm really enjoying the conversation. I will just give the blurb on the book, which is that, I wrote it to help others. I've heard from a lot of people that it has. It is, it has a variety of different things in it. You mentioned the 2 people you spoke to about finances. About 4 months after Lisa died, I was doing the paperwork of death, which is something, the government, state and local wants an accounting, and you have to go through it. And I got so frustrated one day that with just dealing with some of the people on the phone. And then you realize you're dealing with people that don't even know what they're doing themselves. They don't know, and they're making mistakes too. So I wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal on, this is what you should do. This is what you need to do. These are the mistakes I made. Take care of these things now, because you don't want to have to do them later. And one of the things I mentioned in the article was, when someone dies, the last thing in the world you want to have to do, you have so much going on in that first day. You don't want to have to make the decision of burial, cremation. What do you do? And one of the smart things I did, and there weren't that many of them, but one of them was about a year before she died, she didn't want to discuss her death. She could not come to grips with it, and there's a good reason for it. She lost her mother when she was 12, and she was unfortunately saddled with a father. The way I can best describe him is that he was the least likely candidate to have 3 children under his wing. The mother really, I think, took care of things in that family. But one day she would once in a while come up with, she'd be looking at her iPad. This is in the hospital, and I'd be sitting next to her, working on something on my computer. And she would sometimes say things, and she said, well, I guess I'll be buried in Wisconsin. And I just listened to her. And the reason was that I had mentioned my preference of being buried there. Plus, her family cemetery in Philadelphia was the last place you would want to spend eternity. It was in bad shape. It was poorly run. And then she said, but and I always would turn this around, and I would say I would like just a plain pine box and no embalming and a closed casket. And she said, that sounds okay. So when I went out to Wisconsin, and I had to buy some graves in the cemetery where my family has been buried since my great grandparents are there. So that was taken care of. When I mentioned this to baby boomer friends, everyone winces and they don't want to deal with it. And I just say, trust me on this one. You want to take care of this now, because you don't want to have to make that decision on that worst day of your life. Yeah. Get some of the stuff out of the way. Make sure that you have written your beneficiaries for everything, including your checking account. I didn't realize that, and I had to go into probate, for that, which cost a ton of money, and it was unnecessary because I just assumed, well, we have wills, and the wills will. There are people that don't have wills. Take care of that as well. You're not doing this for yourself. You're doing it for the people you love.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
so take care of all these things first. And
Couldn't agree more.
yeah. And I ended the book. I always say, good writers borrow from other writers. Great writers steal. And I kind of did something in between. I knew how Lisa's death affected me. I didn't quite understand how it affected our daughter, because even though we're talking about the same person, losing a wife and losing a mother are 2 very different things. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And about a few months after Lisa died, she sent me something. It was something she wrote for a college class, writing class. And it was about that. It was about the loss of her mother. And the metaphor was our home in Wisconsin, our lake house where I grew up. And it was so beautiful. I said, I asked Claire, I said, can I put this at the end of the book? And she thought about it for a day. And then she said, sure, go ahead. And I think it is the best piece of writing in the book, frankly, and something I'm very proud of. So here's the fun part of the story. I recorded the book for the audiobook. I said, look, it makes sense if I'm going to, it's so personal. Let me read it. And they said, sure. Okay. And I said, I think my daughter should read her part. And they said, yeah, that kind of makes sense. So she came in after my session was done. She is now a teacher here in New York. And she came after school and went in, recorded her part. And as we were leaving, I said, Claire, do you realize where we are? And she said, no. I said, this is called the Brill Building. The Brill Building is this nondescript building in Midtown Manhattan, like 50th and Broadway about, but it's where all of the great rock songs for the 50s and 60s were recorded. There are studios in that building. So there are pictures of, like a 20-year-old Paul Simon and Carole King and all these. I said, Claire, we just recorded in the Brill Building. How cool is that?
Oh, that is a fun story.
Yeah.
It's fun. Well, you have been amazing to chat with. I am so happy I met you and hear your story today. So thank you again for being my guest.
Christine, the pleasure was really mine. It was lovely talking with you. I hope this helps others, and thank you for everything you have done. My God, you have helped so many people with these podcasts. Good for you.
Thank you. I am really enjoying it. And as I mentioned earlier, we are going to have in the podcast notes links to your book and some of your articles that you've added here and so on for anybody who would like to read up and know more about what you've done. So again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, and thank you for letting me talk about waving goodbye.
Yes. Thank you for listening to this episode of Good Grief. To hear more about my personal story, please pick up a copy of my book, The Day I Became the Spider Killer, a memoir of trauma, tragedy, and survival, available in paperback, Kindle, and Audible via Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other online book retailers.